They thought he was just an ordinary rancher. They broke into his property and murdered his loyal companion. What these criminals didn't realize was that the elderly man they underestimated had served as a Marine sharpshooter, and now he's preparing to strike back. In Mexico, a young child named Miguel shares a modest home with his mother, Rosa. During a peaceful afternoon while she prepares their meal, Rosa's phone rings unexpectedly. Her brother Carlos is on the line, his voice trembling with fear. He confesses that a dangerous drug organization is hunting him down after he took a substantial amount of their cash. Panicking and desperate, he begs Rosa to locate the hidden money he left for her and escape Mexico immediately before it's too late. Within minutes of ending the call, the cartel tracks down Carlos. Their brutal commander, Mauricio, seizes Carlos's mobile device and scans through his recent communications. He notices Rosa's contact information among the calls. Without showing any compassion, they kill Carlos on the spot. Across the international boundary in Arizona, a former Marine soldier named Jim maintains his arid farmlands situated near the American-Mexican border. He vigilantly monitors his territory and consistently contacts border protection whenever he observes unauthorized crossings. During one routine day while checking on his livestock, Jim spots a handful of individuals sneaking through the barren landscape and promptly alerts the authorities. Driven by curiosity, he trails them from afar and finds one individual abandoned with a severe leg wound. Jim transmits the injured man's coordinates to border security before quietly heading back to his property. At his farm, Jim's financial troubles continue mounting. A banking official contacts him regarding the outstanding payments he owes. Since he hasn't made a payment in half a year, the representative warns that his land will be auctioned off soon. Jim has been battling severe money problems ever since his wife's extended medical condition depleted all their savings and buried him under crushing debt. Jim desperately requests additional time. The banker eventually informs him he has 90 days to resolve his situation or lose everything. Later, Jim searches for employment opportunities, but the hiring manager tells him the available position isn't appropriate for someone of his years. The man promises to search for a more suitable opening next month. Refusing to surrender, Jim travels to a livestock purchaser, hoping to sell some animals he still possesses. The price offered is devastatingly insufficient, barely covering a tiny portion of what he owes. Drained and discouraged, Jim concludes his exhausting day at a neighborhood tavern. The bartender, noticing his fatigued appearance, contacts his stepdaughter, Sarah, who serves in border protection. Sarah arrives shortly and sits alongside him. They converse quietly, and Jim eventually confesses he's overwhelmed by financial obligations and facing the loss of his home. As the evening progresses, he attempts ordering more drinks, but Sarah intervenes and drives him safely back to his ranch. Meanwhile, Rosa and Miguel flee desperately through rural areas. The following day, approaching the American-Mexican boundary, they discover a narrow opening in the towering steel barrier and attempt squeezing through as the cartel pursues them relentlessly. Jim happens to be in the vicinity when he observes the pair moving through the gap. Rosa, frightened and desperate, begs him not to alert the authorities. Jim, uncertain but cautious, advises her to request assistance from border officials and begins placing a call to report their whereabouts. Within moments, several armed criminals led by Mauricio arrive, demanding he surrender the two fugitives. Understanding the grave danger they face, Jim quickly decides to shield them instead. Violence erupts almost instantly. Jim successfully shoots one attacker and accelerates away in his vehicle with Rosa and Miguel. During the pursuit, Mauricio manages to climb onto Jim's truck, but Jim successfully throws him off before he gains control. When Mauricio discovers the man Jim shot was his own sibling, his fury intensifies dramatically. The operation transforms from recovering stolen currency into something deeply personal. As they escape, Jim realizes Rosa has been struck by gunfire. With her remaining energy, she hands Jim a small folded paper and clothing, explaining they belong to her relatives in Chicago. She pleads with him to transport Miguel there and cautions that if the cartel captures the child, they'll execute him. Moments afterward, she dies. Police officers and emergency responders arrive at the location. Sarah, now informed of the situation, tells Jim that Miguel will remain at the station overnight and enter foster services the next day. The following morning, Jim awakens in his truck near the border checkpoint with his dog, Jackson, resting beside him. He notices a recognizable vehicle stationed nearby. Inside his truck, he discovers a bag Rosa left behind and opens it to find it stuffed with cash. As he examines the blood-stained material, memories of Rosa dying beside him return vividly. The money no longer represents an escape from his troubles. It now symbolizes her final request, an obligation he cannot disregard. Remembering her dying plea, he starts his engine and drives back to locate Miguel. Jim rushes to the border facility to check on the child. Upon arrival, an officer informs him that Miguel was about to be transferred to his alleged relatives in Mexico, but something felt suspicious. Maintaining composure, he requests a few minutes to speak with Miguel privately. The officer consents and permits him entry. Once inside the room, Jim acts swiftly. He quietly guides Miguel down the corridor, exiting through a side entrance without attracting notice. Together, they vanish into the daylight, beginning their escape once more. Outside, Mauricio stands motionless in the parking area, observing as Jim's truck disappears into the distance with the boy. He tells his men that we are crossing to America and kill them both. Back in Arizona, Jim stops temporarily at his farm. He collects some clothing, firearms, and whatever limited cash remains, then prepares to depart. When he returns to his vehicle, he discovers that Miguel has fled. Simultaneously, Mauricio and his men begin crossing the border unlawfully. The border guard who spots them hesitates, immediately recognizing these men as cartel enforcers. Fearing for his existence, the guard permits them to pass without resistance. Fortunately, Jim locates Miguel not far from the ranch and warns him that if those criminals catch him, they'll murder him without hesitation. Together, they embark toward Chicago. As they travel, Jim informs Miguel he's transporting him to Chicago, but the child remains silent. Jim assumes Miguel cannot comprehend English. Meanwhile, after entering the United States, Mauricio drives straight to Jim's property. He breaks into the residence and searches every chamber until he discovers several credit card statements and an old Marine Corps identification. Mauricio pockets the identification and commands his men to incinerate the house. Jim stops at a fueling station to refuel and purchases a paper roadmap to help navigate towards Chicago. Using the credit card receipts, Mauricio begins coordinating with cartel operatives already functioning inside America. Jim later contacts Sarah and learns his ranch has been demolished by the cartel. Enraged, he argues aloud in the vehicle until Miguel quietly responds in English. Miguel admits he doesn't want to be there. Jim tells him he's doing what's right and explains they're heading to his family in Chicago. However, the credit card transaction Jim made at the fueling station reveals his location. Mauricio receives the notification within minutes and races there with his men. When they arrive, Mauricio enters calmly and interrogates the cashier about Jim's direction. When she refuses cooperation, claiming ignorance, Mauricio draws his weapon and shoots her before departing. After examining the station's security recordings, Mauricio learns that Jim is traveling eastward. Later, Jim's truck malfunctions and he takes it to a nearby repair shop. The mechanic apologizes, explaining they're closed for the day. With nowhere else to turn, Jim takes Miguel to a small restaurant nearby. For the first time, they genuinely communicate. They introduce themselves properly, and Jim asks why those men are pursuing him. Miguel explains his uncle encountered serious problems with the cartel, and now they are been hunted because of him. When Jim inquires about his father, Miguel quietly reveals he died before birth. That evening, they sleep inside Jim's truck. The next morning, Jim wakes and discovers Miguel and Jackson are missing. A moment of alarm sets in before he sees them returning with supplies Miguel purchased nearby. Relieved, Jim gets his truck repaired, and they continue their expedition. Jim and Miguel drive using the map he acquired earlier. Mauricio and his men are soon notified of Jim's current position after he pays for the vehicle repair, and they head in that direction. On the highway, Jim and Miguel begin bonding, discussing Jim's own journey to Chicago during his youth. Their peaceful moment is disrupted when a police vehicle appears behind them, flashing its lights and signaling them to stop. The officer approaches and requests Jim's identification. Jim remains calm, explaining he's carrying a lawfully registered firearm and can display the documentation to verify it. The officer, however, appears distrustful and confiscates the weapon, stating he also wants to question the child in the vehicle. Uncomfortable but compliant, Jim agrees and follows the officer toward the patrol vehicle. Once inside, Jim notices the officer speaking quietly into his phone, attempting to avoid being heard. It becomes evident this isn't a routine traffic stop. Jim realizes the man is stalling for time, likely communicating with the cartel. He asks the officer how much he's being compensated to betray his badge. When the officer draws his gun, Jackson attacks him, and together they overpower him. Without delay, Jim knocks the officer unconscious, runs back to the truck, and drives away before the cartel arrives. Shortly afterward, Mauricio and his men reach the location. They discover the officer barely conscious and demand to know Jim's whereabouts, but he cannot provide an answer. In frustration, Mauricio shoots him fatally. While searching the vicinity, he finds Jim's roadmap and takes it. From a distance, Jim and Miguel observe everything unfolding. Later, Jim stops at a firearm shop to purchase some guns. He contacts Sarah and learns the person he shot was Mauricio's brother. Sarah urges him to return the boy. Jim reluctantly agrees. As darkness falls, he and Miguel check into a small motel to rest. During the evening, they converse more and begin understanding each other better. A few hours later, Jim wakes and takes Jackson outside for fresh air. The moment he steps into the cool night, he spots Mauricio and his men nearby. Jim hurries back to the room and quietly wakes Miguel. He calls police to report a false robbery, hoping to divert attention. He helps the child climb out the window, and they move through the darkness into the nearby vegetation. Moments later, the cartel bursts into the motel room, finding it vacant. Furious, Mauricio shouts into the night, vowing to locate Jim. Jim tells Miguel to wait in the truck while he returns for Jackson, but by the time he gets back, it's too late. Jackson, loyal as always, has confronted Mauricio directly. Mauricio raises his weapon and kills him without hesitation. Jim hears the gunfire echoing throughout the night. The next morning, Jim and Miguel bury the dog in a quiet area near the motel. Later, Miguel confronts Jim after seeing the money in the vehicle, accusing him of helping only for financial gain. Hurt, Jim denies it, but Miguel walks away angrily. Soon after, the child returns, and they both apologize before continuing their journey. Not long after, they stop at a small chapel, and Miguel kneels at the altar, murmuring a prayer for his mother, while Jim stands silently behind him. When the priest approaches and gently asks if Miguel is his grandson, Jim softly answers that he isn't, explaining he promised the boy's mother he would keep him protected. Later, Jim contacts Sarah to inform her what's happening. She pleads with him to hand Miguel over to the authorities, warning that circumstances are becoming extremely dangerous. Unfortunately, Jim refuses. He made a commitment to Rosa, and he intends to honor it regardless of the consequences. He explains to Sarah he's heading to Chicago to deliver the child safely to his relatives. As Jim and Miguel continue towards Chicago, Mauricio and his men keep searching for any indication that might reveal their whereabouts. Eventually, they find Jim's map in their vehicle. On it, a red circle is marked around Chicago, confirming their destination. Mauricio immediately contacts cartel operatives already stationed in the city, ordering them to be prepared when Jim and the boy arrive. Sometime later, Miguel finds Jim practicing with his rifle. Curious, he joins him, and Jim begins teaching him how to aim and fire accurately, and disassemble and reassemble the weapon. Miguel tells him that, when he matures, he plans to eliminate those men for what they did. Jim looks at him firmly and tells him there's nothing exciting or honorable about taking another person's life. He reminds him his mother sacrificed herself so he could have a better existence. That night, Jim and Miguel take refuge beneath an old bridge. To stay warm, they ignite a small fire, feeding it with bundles of cartel currency. The cash no longer holds meaning to them, but survival does. By the next morning, they finally reach the outskirts of Chicago. While driving along a freeway, Jim notices two suspicious individuals watching from a bridge above. To protect Miguel, he turns off the main highway and drives into the countryside. Cartel vehicles close in rapidly, and one vehicle pulls up alongside them. Jim swerves sharply, sending it crashing into the trees. He realizes the truck's radiator is failing. He keeps driving until they reach a remote open field and then stops the vehicle. Drawing on his military experience, Jim takes up a position with his rifle, steadies his breathing, and fires. His shot hits the driver of Mauricio's vehicle, flipping it off the road. The vehicle crashes violently, leaving only Mauricio and two of his men crawling from the wreckage. One of them opens fire toward Jim's position. Jim grabs Miguel and pulls him along as they run toward an abandoned farmhouse nearby. They slip into a dusty old shed where Jim positions himself near a cracked window. He tells Miguel that if anything happens to him, he must run as fast and far as possible. Through the broken glass, Jim spots one of the cartel men approaching. He studies his rifle once again, squeezes the trigger, and drops the man instantly. Only two enemies remain. Acting quickly, Jim tells Miguel to stay inside and fire into the air to draw their attention. As the sound of gunfire echoes across the field, Jim moves quietly around to the side of the building. The distraction works, and when one of the other men steps out into the open, Jim steadies his aim and takes the shot, killing him instantly. Now only the leader, Mauricio, remains. Moments later, Mauricio breaks into the shed and grabs Miguel, pressing a gun to the boy's head. He orders Jim to drop his weapon. Jim slowly lowers it, keeping his eyes locked on Mauricio. Then, Mauricio shoves the gun into Miguel's trembling hands and orders him to pull the trigger. Miguel, remembering how Jim showed him to disassemble a gun, quickly removes the clip. Mauricio shots Jim, but when he tries to get the clip, Jim tackles him, and a fight erupts between the two. The two men fight violently, trading punches and grappling across the floor. During the struggle, Miguel grabs the gun and points it at Mauricio. The man doesn't plead or beg. Instead, he dares the boy to shoot him. Jim sees the anger and pain building in Miguel's eyes and steps in, telling him not to listen and that he should never live with that burden. Jim takes the gun from the boy and fires once, hitting Mauricio in the abdomen. He then tells Miguel to step outside. As Jim raises his weapon again, Mauricio, bleeding and weakened, pulls something from his pocket. It's a Marine badge he'd stolen from Jim's home. Jim takes it back and gives him a final choice: face him or end his own life. Mauricio makes his decision and turns the gun on himself. A single gunshot echoes through the quiet countryside. With the danger finally over, Jim and Miguel resume their journey. Before long, they reach the address written on Rosa's note. Miguel knocks on the door, and it opens to reveal his aunt and grandmother standing inside. Before the boy can turn around to say goodbye, Jim quietly slips away. Jim boards a bus, clutching his wounded side. He takes a seat near the window, exhales slowly, and closes his eyes. The fight, the promise, and the long road behind him now seem to fade away. The bus pulls forward, and Jim rides off in silence, his mission finally complete.